I was exactly 31 years old when my sister turned our parents' funeral into a hostile takeover. The flowers in the Houston living room had not wilted before she called her lawyer. Numb with grief, I watched her slide a torn deed across the table with a mocking smirk. "Take this shabby house," Celeste declared, dumping a rotting Galveston property and its hidden debts onto me. "I do not need it anyway." She thought she had won everything. My name is Morgan Flores. I was exactly 31 years old the day I buried my parents. The dark earth on their twin caskets had not even settled when my older sister, Celeste, dragged me straight from the humid cemetery into the formal living room of our family home in Sugar Land, Texas. The massive funeral wreaths, banked high against the mahogany walls, had not yet begun to wilt. The sickly sweet, overpowering scent of white lilies and stagnant air clung to my black dress, suffocating me. Celeste moved through the cavernous room with the brisk, ruthless energy of a corporate liquidator. She did not look like a grieving daughter. She looked like a woman who had been waiting for the starting gun to fire for a very long time. She had summoned her private attorney, a slick, sharp-suited man named Richard, to the house on the exact same afternoon we put our mother and father in the ground. I was standing by the tall bay window, staring blankly at the perfectly manicured lawn. My mind was entirely numb, my body hollowed out by 18 months of hospital vigils, midnight emergency room runs, and the crushing, suffocating weight of sudden, double loss. I had absolutely no capacity for strategic thought. I barely had the energy to keep my lungs expanding and contracting. "Sit down, Morgan," Celeste ordered, her voice cutting through the thick, oppressive quiet of the room. "Let us get this paperwork settled neatly and quickly. I have a first-class flight back to Atlanta tomorrow morning, and Richard has graciously cleared his entire afternoon schedule for us." I moved like a ghost, sitting on the very edge of the tufted leather sofa. Richard popped open the polished brass locks of his Italian leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of pristine manila folders. His voice was a flat, practiced drone, a calculated monotone designed to glaze over the brutal, ugly realities of wealth transfer. As he spoke, the thick fog of grief in my brain began to thin, slowly replaced by a cold, sharp, and highly concentrated spike of adrenaline. Through his sanitized, sterile legal jargon, the complete architecture of my sister's betrayal took its final shape. During the last 2 years, while I was taking an unpaid leave of absence from my job as a disaster claims adjuster to physically bathe our mother and coordinate our father's complex hospice care, Celeste had been incredibly busy with different kinds of paperwork. From the comfort of her pristine high-rise condo in Georgia, she had secured an ironclad financial power of attorney. She had quietly reorganized their entire portfolio. She had made careful, deliberate arrangements. Richard read the outcomes with zero emotion. The vast liquid assets, the expansive Sugar Land estate we were currently sitting inside, the 2 luxury vehicles in the garage, the high-yield retirement accounts, and the lucrative stock portfolios had all been cleanly, legally funneled into private trusts and offshore accounts controlled entirely by Celeste Flores. She had methodically drained the reservoir while I was busy bleeding out trying to hold the dam together. I stared at the pristine white paperwork laid out on the heavy glass coffee table. "You transferred everything into your own name while they were highly medicated on morphine," I stated. My voice was completely devoid of inflection. I did not ask it as a question. It was a cold, hard fact. Celeste crossed her long legs, smoothing the fabric of her designer morning skirt. "I protected the family assets from predatory medical billing and probate taxes," she corrected smoothly, not missing a single beat. Her face was a mask of flawless, practiced innocence. "Mom and Dad explicitly wanted me to handle the complex financial matters. You know you were always far too emotional, Morgan. Too caught up in the messy day-to-day nursing to see the big picture." "The big picture," I repeated softly. "Richard, show her what she gets," Celeste commanded, waving a dismissive hand. Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second before sliding a single, painfully thin folder across the vast expanse of the glass table toward me. It looked utterly pathetic compared to the towering mountain of documents stacked securely on Celeste's side. I opened it slowly. Inside was a property deed. It was not a hidden trust fund, nor was it a secondary investment account. It was the deed to a rotting, severely dilapidated coastal cottage down in Galveston, Texas. I recognized the address immediately. It was a small property our parents had purchased 3 decades ago, a place that had been steadily decaying, eaten alive year after year by the harsh, unforgiving Gulf Coast salt air. I scanned the attached supplementary documents. They were not assets. They were aggressive liabilities. The file was stuffed tight with red-inked notices. There were 3 solid years of unpaid, heavily penalized property taxes. I saw a thick stack of severe structural citations from the Galveston Code Enforcement Division. There were final warnings detailing a crumbling concrete foundation, a dangerously compromised roof, and a direct, written threat of immediate city foreclosure and municipal demolition if the massive list of violations was not completely rectified within 60 days. It was a financial sinkhole, a dead weight designed to drown whoever held it. Celeste leaned forward, tapping her perfectly manicured fingernail against the hard glass. She pushed the torn, cornered deed right to the absolute edge of the table, a cruel, mocking smile finally breaking through her composed facade. She looked at the weathered papers as if they were infected with a deadly disease. "Take this shabby house," my sister declared, her voice dripping with absolute, unfiltered contempt. "I do not need it anyway. Consider it your grand inheritance. You always liked the beach." She thought she was handing me garbage. She believed, with 100% absolute certainty, that she had just won a total, unquestionable victory. She had secured all the generational wealth and deliberately handed me a toxic, collapsing liability that would bankrupt me within 6 months. But as I read the final, yellowed sheet of paper buried at the back of the meager file, the true, breathtaking depth of her cruelty materialized. There was a handwritten residency addendum attached to the title. Living inside that decaying, salt-eaten shell in Galveston was Rosa Delgado, Aunt Rosa. She was our mother's older cousin. When Celeste and I were young children, and our parents were ruthlessly building their corporate careers, Rosa had been the one to actually raise us. She had cooked our daily meals, bandaged our scraped knees, and loved us with a fierce, uncompromising, and unconditional loyalty. Now, Rosa was in her late 70s. A recent, devastating hip fracture had severely compromised her physical mobility, leaving her frail, isolated, and entirely dependent on outside help. Help that had obviously been cut off months ago. The silence in the grand living room grew heavy and suffocating. The dark, unspoken truth hung in the air between us, toxic and undeniable. Celeste was not merely dumping a ruined, worthless coastal property on my shoulders. She was dumping a living, breathing human being. She was offloading the grueling, expensive, and thoroughly unglamorous duty of elder care. She was gleefully handing me the mounting medical bills, the structural filth, the leaking roof, and the forgotten, highly inconvenient remnants of our family history. She had ruthlessly taken the gold and left me the dying. Richard cleared his throat softly, clearly uncomfortable with the prolonged, heavy silence. "If you will just sign your name on the dotted line right there, Morgan, we can officially conclude this matter." I did not pick up the expensive pen. I picked up the frayed, torn-cornered deed to the Galveston cottage. The cheap, aged paper felt incredibly rough against my fingertips. A normal person might have broken down right then and there. A normal sister might have screamed until her throat bled, thrown the heavy crystal ashtray across the room, or collapsed onto the floor in a fit of hysterical weeping at the sheer, calculating malice of it all. I felt the familiar, acidic burn of grief rising at the back of my throat, the desperate, clawing urge to cry for the parents I had just put in the dark earth and the family I had just lost forever. But I swallowed it down hard. I forced the burning tears back until my eyes felt like dry, cracked glass. Crying in front of Celeste was a luxury I could not afford, a weakness she would only weaponize against me. I looked up from the torn deed and fixed my unblinking gaze directly on my sister. I studied her perfectly styled hair, the expensive fabric of her black morning dress, and the triumphant, deeply condescending gleam shining in her dark eyes. I saw exactly who she was. The sister I thought I had grown up with was buried at the cemetery alongside my parents. The woman sitting across the table from me was a parasite who had quietly fed on their dying days to gorge herself on their life's work. I realized, with a sudden, chilling, and absolute clarity, that this was not a standard estate settlement. This was not a division of property between two grieving siblings. This was a meticulously planned execution. Celeste had orchestrated this entire scenario to bury me under a massive mountain of debt, physical obligation, and structural decay, guaranteeing I would never have the financial resources or the energy to challenge her or rise above the miserable station she had assigned me. I held her gaze for a long, heavy, unbroken minute. The mocking smile slowly faltered on her painted lips, quickly replaced by a sharp flicker of genuine irritation. She wanted a massive reaction. She desperately wanted to see my despair. I gave her absolutely nothing. "Fine," I said. My voice was dangerously quiet, completely stripped of all warmth and emotion. I reached forward and took the heavy gold pen Richard offered. I did not bother reading the dense indemnification clauses or the thick legal waivers that officially absolved Celeste of any future financial or moral claims. None of those papers mattered anymore. The ink flowed black and permanent across the final signature line. I stood up slowly, taking only the thin manila folder containing the deed to the rotting Galveston cottage and the fragile life of Aunt Rosa. I did not say a single word of goodbye to the lawyer. I did not look back at the sweeping mahogany staircase or the expensive, curated artwork hanging on the walls of the house I grew up in. I walked directly toward the heavy front door, every single step a highly calculated measure of physical restraint. As my hand gripped the cool brass doorknob, I felt the rough, torn edges of the property deed pressing hard against my palm. Celeste had thrown me to the wolves, fully expecting me to be eaten alive by the crushing debts, the mold, and the rot. She had made a massive, catastrophic miscalculation. She had completely forgotten what I did for a living before I paused my entire life to care for our dying parents. I was a professional disaster claims adjuster. I knew exactly how to look at a totally destroyed, hopeless situation and calculate precisely what it took to rebuild it from the ground up. I walked out into the blinding, oppressive Texas heat, holding the only piece of my family legacy she deemed entirely worthless. I did not shed a single tear as I walked to my rented truck. I just gripped the folder tighter, feeling the raw, sharp, metallic taste of pure adrenaline flooding my mouth. This was no longer a family. This was a declaration of war. And I was going to fight it with the exact piece of garbage she had so carelessly thrown away. The rented moving truck rumbled loudly down Interstate 45 South. The sky above the Texas Gulf Coast was a bruised, heavy slate gray, pressing down on the flat landscape like a physical weight. The fierce wind whipping off the water carried a thick, abrasive coating of sea salt that smeared stubbornly across my windshield, blurring the road ahead. Inside the cab of the truck, the silence was deafening. My chest felt like a hollowed-out cavern, scraped entirely empty by the morning funeral and then immediately flooded back to the brim with a cold, paralyzing rage. Every single mile I drove away from the pristine, manicured suburbs of Houston was a mile deeper into the meticulously crafted trap my sister had set for me. I pulled the heavy truck onto a cracked, weed-choked asphalt driveway in a forgotten, battered neighborhood on the island. The property standing before me did not look like a family inheritance. It looked exactly like the grim, immediate aftermath of a Category 4 hurricane. The heavy iron front gate had been violently wrenched off its rusted hinges, half buried in a tangled mass of overgrown coastal grass. The front porch, built from once sturdy pine, had completely collapsed on the left side, resting at a drunken, defeated angle against the foundation. Above it, the roof was missing dozens of asphalt shingles, exposing the vulnerable, sun-baked black tar paper underneath like raw, gaping wounds. The exterior walls were the absolute worst part. The pale blue paint was blistering and peeling away in massive, jagged sheets, making the entire house look like a dying creature that was actively shedding its flayed skin. Pushing open the swollen, waterlogged front door required putting my entire shoulder into the rotting wood. The moment I crossed the threshold, the stagnant air hit me like a physical blow. It was a suffocating, dense mixture of black mold, crystallized sea salt, rotting subfloor, and the sharp metallic tang of oxidized copper pipes. It was the distinct, undeniable odor of total abandonment. The house felt as though it had been left completely defenseless, locked up and ignored through half a dozen brutal storm seasons. The living room was submerged in a murky, heavy gloom. Sitting perfectly still in a faded floral armchair, wrapped tightly in a thin woolen shawl despite the suffocating Texas humidity, was Rosa Delgado. My breath caught sharply in my throat. The vibrant, fiercely energetic woman who had practically raised me was entirely gone. In her place sat a fragile, skeletal figure. Her cheeks were deeply hollowed out, and her dark eyes looked huge and exhausted behind her thick glasses. The aluminum walker resting near her knee was a stark, cruel reminder of her shattered hip. Spread haphazardly across the scarred wooden coffee table were mismatched orange pill bottles, some knocked over, alongside a half-eaten sleeve of stale saltine crackers. I dropped my keys, walked straight into the tiny kitchen, and pulled open the refrigerator door. The yellow bulb flickered violently. Inside sat a single plastic jug of tap water, a badly bruised apple, and a glass jar of mustard. That was the entirety of her food supply. I walked back and sat down directly on the dusty floor next to her armchair, taking her paper-thin hands in mine. Her voice was barely a rough whisper, frequently broken by dry, painful coughs. Through her fragmented, exhausted sentences, the brutal reality of the past year fully crystallized in my mind. The monthly financial stipend our parents had arranged for her groceries, utilities, and medical supplies had not just stopped recently, it had been abruptly, mercilessly severed exactly 8 months ago. Celeste had taken absolute control of the family bank accounts long before our parents passed away, and she had immediately cut the financial lifeline to Galveston to maximize her own portfolio. Not once in those 8 months had my sister driven down here to check if the elderly woman who had fed us as children was quietly starving to death in a rotting house. The heavy grief tried to pull me under the surface, but the trained disaster claims adjuster inside me violently rejected the despair. I stood up, wiped my dusty hands on my black dress, and began a tactical, cold-blooded sweep of the property. I did not look at the house with emotion anymore. I looked at it as a forensic damage report. The deeper I went into the dark hallway, the worse the structural diagnosis became. The original hardwood floors were severely buckled and swollen from pooling standing water. Under the kitchen sink, a steady, insidious drip from a heavily corroded cast-iron pipe was actively eating away the lower wooden cabinets. The electrical situation was a terrifying, immediate fire hazard. Cheap extension cords were daisy-chained recklessly across multiple rooms, plugged into overloaded, ungrounded wall sockets. When I yanked open a stuck wooden drawer in the hallway console table, I found the true ticking clock. The drawer was stuffed to the absolute brim with aggressively stamped envelopes from the Galveston Municipal Code Enforcement Division. There were dozens of them. Final warnings, red-tagged citations, demolition threats. A heavy, authoritative knock on the front door frame interrupted my grim audit. I walked out to the sagging porch to find a tall, broad-shouldered man standing in the overgrown front yard. He had a weathered, deeply lined face, heavily calloused hands, and wore a faded denim workshirt. He introduced himself as Elias Boone, the neighbor from the property directly across the chain-link fence. He was a retired commercial electrician. He did not offer me any polite, meaningless condolences about my parents. He looked right past me at the flayed siding of the walls and gave it to me completely straight. He told me the city inspectors had been circling the property like vultures for the past 6 weeks. The final demolition notice was already drafted and waiting for a judge's signature. According to Elias, if massive, highly visible structural improvements were not initiated within exactly 30 days, the city would send the heavy bulldozers, flatten the lot to the dirt, and slap a massive municipal lien on the land that would ruin my financial credit permanently. By the time the sun finally set over the Gulf, plunging the ruined house into absolute darkness, the exhaustion in my bones felt terminal. I could not risk turning on the main electrical breaker due to the severely compromised wiring Elias had pointed out. I used a single, battery-powered camping lantern I had purchased at a gas station on the drive down. I laid a thick, moving blanket out on the warped wooden floorboards of the living room, making a makeshift bed close to Rosa's armchair so I could hear her if she tried to stand up in the dark. The first night was an absolute nightmare. The coastal wind picked up speed, violently lashing against the thin, uninsulated walls. The entire wooden structure groaned and shivered under the barometric pressure. Every single creak of the rotting timber sounded like a countdown to total collapse. Lying there in the pitch black, feeling the cold, damp draft sweeping across the floorboards, the absolute magnitude of Celeste's cruelty settled heavily over my chest. Giving up right now would be incredibly easy. It would be the logical choice. I could pack my bag, drive back to Houston, declare personal bankruptcy, and let the city tear this entire miserable nightmare down to the foundation. But as I lay there, listening to Rosa's shallow, labored breathing in the chair above me, a cold, hard truth crystallized in my mind. If I surrendered this house, I was not just losing a piece of distressed real estate. I was handing my sister the final undisputed victory. I would be allowing her to dictate my worth, letting her erase the only person left on earth who truly cared for me, and accepting the role of the helpless victim she had assigned me. If I walked out that door, I would lose the very last shred of my self-respect. I pushed myself up onto my elbows. The pale, weak beam of the battery lantern caught Rosa's face. She was awake. She was watching me with a silent, fearful apology in her dark eyes, looking at me as if her mere existence was a terrible burden she was profoundly sorry to impose on my life. I reached out and rested my hand firmly on her frail knee. I looked directly into her eyes and made a vow that would permanently alter the entire trajectory of both our lives. "They can throw this place to me like garbage," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the sound of the howling wind with absolute, unbreakable certainty. But I will not let it die. The alarm on my phone buzzed at exactly 4:30 in the morning. I did not hit snooze. I dragged myself off the hard floorboards, swallowed 2 dry ibuprofen pills, and strapped a heavy-duty respirator mask tightly over my face. Surviving this was not going to be a matter of blind hope or waiting for a miracle. It was going to be an unforgiving equation of sheer, brutal, physical labor. By 6 o'clock, the Texas sun was already baking the coastal humidity into a suffocatingly thick soup, and I was on my hands and knees in the narrow hallway with a heavy steel scraper. The black mold had aggressively colonized the lower 3 feet of the drywall. I spent 6 straight hours tearing out the infected gypsum board, bagging the hazardous, crumbling debris into thick black contractor sacks, and dragging them out to the curb. My fingernails cracked and bled. My shoulders burned with a deep, acidic fire. I did not allow myself a single moment to sit down and cry. Crying did not fix rotting wood, and it certainly did not pay the mounting municipal fines. When the afternoon heat became physically dangerous, I climbed a rickety aluminum ladder to the roof. Armed with 3 heavy-duty blue tarps and 2 boxes of galvanized roofing nails, I crawled over the blistering asphalt shingles. I patched the gaping holes where the sky showed through, securing the thick plastic against the inevitable afternoon squalls. Every swing of the hammer was a mechanical, precise strike. I was teaching myself basic carpentry and emergency weatherproofing on the fly, watching tutorial videos on my phone while balancing on the steep pitch of the roof. Desperate to save every single penny, I simply could not afford to hire a professional crew to do what I could force my own hands to learn. When the sun finally dropped below the horizon and the immediate physical labor ceased, my second shift began. I set up a battered folding table in the corner of the living room, directly under the single working light bulb. I flipped open my laptop and logged into the remote server for Blue Meridian claims. It was the disaster loss assessment firm where I had worked before my parents fell ill, and I had practically begged my old manager to let me take on independent estimating files at night, from 8 in the evening until 2 in the morning. My exhausted eyes scanned complex insurance policies, cross-referencing structural damage photographs from recent storms across the Gulf Coast against standardized construction costs. I processed adjusters' reports, calculating strict depreciation and material overhead. I needed the direct deposit desperately. Rose's heart and blood pressure medications alone cost $450 a month out of pocket, and the local utility company required a steep security deposit just to keep the running water turned on. On the third afternoon, Elias Boone walked over with a heavy canvas tool bag slung casually over his shoulder. He did not bother knocking, just let himself through the broken gate and found me trying to decipher the chaotic, terrifying mess of wires near the main breaker box. He nudged me aside gently and spent 2 hours testing the circuits with a digital multimeter. When he finally flipped his visor up, his weathered face held a look of quiet respect. He pointed the heavy tip of his screwdriver at the exposed wall studs where I had torn away the drywall. He told me the house was absolutely not hopeless. He showed me the old growth pine framing, pointing out the dense, tightly packed wood grain that modern commercial lumber simply did not possess. He said the core bones of the house were incredibly strong, built back in an era when craftsmen actually cared about storms and structural integrity. It had just been horribly neglected by blind people who were too obsessed with shiny surfaces to look past the peeling paint and see its true, enduring value. His words were a quiet, steadying anchor in the middle of the chaos. That weekend, I forced myself to tackle the suffocating, dusty oven of the attic. The stagnant air up there was easily 110 degrees, thick with ancient dust and irritating fiberglass insulation. As I was clearing out broken lamps and forgotten, water-stained cardboard boxes, my flashlight beam caught the dull gleam of a heavy, olive-green metal footlocker shoved deep under the wooden eaves. The heavy iron latch was stiff with rust, but I managed to pry it open with the flat edge of a crowbar. Inside, carefully wrapped in heavy layers of plastic sheeting, was an absolute revelation. I found my mother's meticulous architectural sketches drawn on heavy drafting paper, layered right beside my father's old, leather-bound contractor notebook. Beneath them lay a comprehensive structural foundation survey drafted by a licensed civil engineer over a decade ago. I sat cross-legged on the rough attic joists, my heart pounding a steady, hard rhythm against my ribs as I read through their precise, handwritten notes. They had not bought this miserable property as a cheap, throwaway vacation home. Their notes detailed a highly specific, calculated plan to retrofit this exact coastal cottage into a scalable, low-cost, hurricane-resistant model home. They had mapped out reinforced structural load paths, impact-resistant window framing, and safely elevated mechanical systems. They had fully intended to build a physical prototype for resilient coastal living, creating a practical blueprint to protect working-class families from losing everything to the violent Gulf storms. But before they could even pull the first municipal building permit, the aggressive cancer diagnoses had hit. The medical bills had piled up into mountains, and the brutal reality of their rapidly declining health had swept all those brilliant, ambitious plans into the dark corner of this attic. Celeste had walked away with the liquid cash, the massive stock portfolios, and the luxury cars. But sitting in that sweltering attic, wiping a thick layer of sweat and dirt from my forehead, I realized I had inherited their actual dream. Armed with this newfound knowledge, I walked out to the overgrown backyard to aggressively inspect the detached, sagging garage that I had initially written off as a complete teardown. I used the heavy crowbar to force the jammed wooden doors open. The interior was packed floor to ceiling, not with garbage, but with a meticulously curated salvage yard. My father had been quietly stockpiling premium materials for the retrofit. There were tall stacks of beautiful reclaimed oak boards, heavy wrought iron handrails, vintage solid core doors, and heavy-duty contractor tools that just needed a little machine oil and elbow grease to run perfectly again. It was a staggering treasure trove of raw materials that would have cost me tens of thousands of dollars to source at a commercial lumberyard today. Later that evening, While I was preparing a simple dinner of rice and canned beans on a hot plate, Rosa called me over to her chair. In a rare moment of sharp, brilliant lucidity, she grasped my wrist with surprising strength. She told me the real reason my mother had fiercely refused to sell this place, even when the property taxes became a severe financial burden. Rosa pointed a trembling finger toward the dark front window facing the water. She said my mother never cared that the house was ugly or out of fashion. She loved it because it was a fortress. It had stood stubbornly firm through 4 major, devastating hurricanes, taking the absolute worst beatings the Gulf of Mexico could dish out, while the massive, expensive, beautiful mansions up the coast had shattered into kindling and washed out to sea. It survived because it was built to endure, not just to look pretty for a magazine cover. I needed a reliable way to document the daily structural changes for the strict city inspectors, but I also desperately needed a psychological anchor to keep myself disciplined. I propped my cell phone against a stack of red bricks on the front porch and recorded a raw, unedited 60-second video. I showed the rotting wood, the black mold, and the brilliant architectural plans I had found in the metal trunk. I spoke directly into the camera in a flat, pragmatic tone about the brutal reality of tearing out the rot to find the solid bone underneath. I posted it to a social media platform, treating it purely as a digital log of my daily physical labor. I did not expect the algorithm to pick it up. I certainly did not expect the quiet, battered, working-class residents of the island to notice it. The major turning point arrived exactly 2 weeks later. I was sitting on the concrete front steps, nursing a mug of cheap, bitter coffee, when a woman pulled up in a faded blue sedan. She introduced herself as Sarah, a neighbor from 3 streets over. She looked completely exhausted, clutching a manila folder tight against her chest like a shield. She said Elias had mentioned I knew my way around complicated construction paperwork. A recent tropical depression had violently torn the roof off her back patio, and the contractor she called had just handed her a repair estimate that she was absolutely certain would bankrupt her entire family. She handed me the document. I did not even need to open my laptop. The exact skills I had spent years honing at Blue Meridian Claims snapped instantly into sharp focus. I scanned the itemized list, my eyes easily catching the bloated line items, the artificially inflated material costs, and the duplicate labor charges deliberately buried in complex, confusing contractor jargon. The guy was charging her a 20% premium for specialized underlayment that was not even required by current Galveston building codes. I took my pen, crossed out 4 separate lines of pure fraud, and calculated the accurate, standardized cost right there on the hood of her car. I told her exactly what to say to the contractor and which specific building code statutes to quote to back him into a corner. As I watched her drive away, a sharp, electric realization shot through my exhausted body, wiping away the fatigue. I was not just a woman desperately trying to patch a rotting house anymore. My professional expertise, the very specialized skill set I had used to evaluate disaster zones for massive corporations, was the exact weapon I needed to carve out my own survival right here in the salt and the dirt. The broken house and my professional brain had finally connected, striking a spark that was about to catch fire. Sarah returned exactly 4 days after our brief conversation on her cracked driveway. She did not just come back with a simple thank you. She walked up to my sagging porch, holding a heavy manila envelope and a look of absolute shock. Armed with the exact building code statutes and the itemized line corrections I had written out for her, she had backed her predatory contractor into a legal corner. More importantly, she had forced her insurance carrier to completely reevaluate her storm claim. The carrier had issued a supplemental check for $12,500 to cover the actual, legitimate scope of the damages. She pressed 5 crisp $100 bills into my dirty hands. I tried to refuse, but she stepped back and shook her head firmly. Word of mouth in a working-class coastal town travels much faster than a Gulf Coast storm surge. My personal cell phone started ringing the very next morning. A retired diesel mechanic from 3 blocks down had his roof replacement claim wrongfully denied based on a technicality. A local school teacher was handed a $75,000 repair estimate for a blown-out sunroom that should not have cost a single dime over $30,000. I quickly discovered my hyper-specific superpower. Most people look at a 30-page, densely coded insurance estimate and completely freeze. They see a wall of intimidating numbers and blindly trust the people in the polo shirts. I looked at those same documents and saw a very clear, highly predictable matrix. I was exceptionally good at translating the dense, predatory language of insurance adjustments and spotting exactly where contractors were padding the bill. I knew how to read a line item for drywall replacement and immediately catch when a company was charging a 20% premium for a specialized finish while secretly planning to install cheap, builder-grade trash. I could spot duplicate charges for debris removal hidden deep in the plumbing margins. I was not just doing favors for neighbors anymore. I was building a barricade. I filed the official paperwork online, paying the $300 state registration fee with the cash Sarah had given me. I named the company Gulf Lantern Retrofit and Design. It was a formal entity dedicated to reviewing loss files, consulting on realistic repair scopes, and drafting airtight renovation permits for homeowners who had been chewed up by storms and spat out by the system. It was my very first aggressive step towards standing up entirely on my own professional expertise. The physical layout of the rotting cottage had to change to accommodate this new reality. I used a roll of bright blue painter's tape to draw a strict line right down the center of the warped living room floorboards. The left side belonged entirely to Rosa. It held her faded floral armchair, her aluminum walker, and the small television kept at a low volume. The right side became ground zero for Gulf Lantern. I bought a refurbished laser printer at a pawn shop, pushed 3 plastic folding tables together against the exposed wall studs, and covered them with heavy architectural blueprints, thick municipal building code manuals, and towering stacks of client invoices. The most remarkable transformation, however, happened right across that blue-taped line. Rosa absolutely hated feeling useless. One busy Tuesday afternoon, while I was trapped under the crawl space fighting to seal a rusted plumbing joint, the company cell phone rang on the folding table. I could not reach it. Rosa picked it up. By the time I crawled out from under the house, covered in wet dirt and spider webs, she had a yellow legal pad resting squarely on her lap. She had carefully written down a new client's full name, their property address, the exact date of their storm loss, and scheduled an initial site consultation for Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock. Her handwriting, which had been shaky and weak from deep depression just weeks ago, was suddenly firm and precise. She started managing my entire daily calendar. She organized the physical manila client folders alphabetically. She strictly reminded me to email supplemental demands before the rigid 30-day legal deadlines expired. Rosa stopped being the heavy, disposable burden my sister thought she had dumped on me. She rapidly evolved into the sharp, indispensable backbone of my daily operations. We were a team operating out of a ruined house, and we were winning. As the consulting checks finally started clearing the bank, I aggressively pumped every single available dollar back into the cottage. I did not buy new clothes. I did not upgrade my diet from canned soup and rice. I bought heavy-duty, commercial-grade vapor barriers to seal the damp earth under the foundation, permanently stopping the rot from eating the floor joists. I hired Elias to officially upgrade the sketchy surface electrical panel, pulling legitimate municipal permits so the city code enforcers would finally back off. I bought premium structural pine and spent an entire weekend rebuilding the collapsed front porch, driving every single 3-inch galvanized screw into the wood myself. The house stopped smelling like decay and mold. It started smelling like fresh sawdust, machine oil, and ozone. It transformed from a dead weight waiting for a city bulldozer into a living structure that had a fighting chance. But climbing out of the dirt always attracts the attention of the people who profit from keeping you there. Success inevitably breeds enemies. I caught a local contractor, a loud, highly aggressive guy named Gary, who ran a massive fleet of heavily decaled trucks, trying to scam an elderly couple out of $45,000 for a basic siding replacement. I tore his entire estimate apart line by line in a formal email. I copied the homeowners, their insurance adjuster, and Gary himself. explicitly citing the Texas Penal Code for contractor fraud. Gary lost the lucrative job immediately. 3 days later, a sharp, authoritative knock hit my newly rebuilt front door. It was not a client. It was a senior investigator from the state licensing board, explicitly tipped off by an anonymous complaint from Gary. The accusation was severe. Gary had reported that I was actively practicing public adjusting and structural engineering without the proper state licenses. It was a serious legal charge that carried massive financial fines and the very real threat of criminal prosecution. The investigator stood in my living room, wearing a crisp white shirt and flashing a heavy brass badge. He looked condescendingly around my makeshift folding table office, clearly expecting to easily intimidate a desperate, uneducated woman running a scam out of a shabby house. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of panic. I calmly walked over to the filing cabinet and pulled open the bottom metal drawer. I handed him my active, fully paid state adjuster license, which I had rigorously maintained precisely for hostile situations exactly like this one. Then, I handed him the explicit consulting contracts every single one of my clients signed. The documents clearly defined my legal role as a project manager and independent design consultant, perfectly shielding me from any engineering liabilities. Finally, I placed a meticulously organized, thick black binder directly into his hands. It contained time-stamped site photos, verified material receipts, and a dozen copies of the fraudulent, highly inflated estimates Gary had been aggressively circulating throughout the coastal neighborhood. I looked the investigator dead in the eye and spoke with absolute, chilling precision. I walked him through the exact mathematical discrepancies in the contractor's bids, pointing out the phantom labor charges and the illegal overhead stacking. The investigator's aggressive, dominant posture slowly dissolved right there in my living room. He spent 45 solid minutes quietly reviewing my immaculate documentation. He cross-referenced the dates and checked the legal statutes I had highlighted. When he finally closed the heavy black binder, the condescension in his eyes was entirely gone. He did not issue a single citation. He did not write a fine. He looked at me with genuine, professional respect, tucked my business card into his front shirt pocket, and told me he would be opening a formal state fraud investigation into Gary's business practices by the end of the week. I closed the front door, leaned my back against the solid, newly reinforced wood, and let out a long breath. I had just taken my first real punch from the outside world, and I had not just survived it, I had broken the guy's hand. By the end of my second month operating out of the divided living room, the sheer volume of my specialized consulting work began to snowball. I secured 3 distinct, consecutive coastal renovation projects within a single 14-day window. These were not massive luxury overhauls. They were modest, localized recovery jobs, but they provided enough steady capital to formally expand. Elias Boone officially stepped out of his quiet retirement to become my lead electrical supervisor. I aggressively recruited Tori Hale, a 22-year-old custom welder who spent her weekends building roll cages for dirt track racers. She possessed a brilliant, uncompromising eye for reinforcing structural steel against high wind shear. Rounding out our small crew was Ben Rollins, a deeply quiet, broad-shouldered Finnish carpenter who communicated mostly in short grunts but could read a severely compromised load-bearing wall with absolute mathematical precision. We were a tiny, scrappy operation, but our combined technical literacy was completely unmatched on the island. I could not afford to rent a commercial office space, so my rotting Galveston cottage officially became our live testing facility. Every single concept I pitched to my paying clients was aggressively physically trialed on my own exterior walls first. When Tori designed a custom, heavy-duty steel hurricane tie-down system, she welded the very first prototype directly into my exposed roof joists. When Ben sourced a highly specialized, salt-resistant waterproof membrane, we wrapped my vulnerable western wall in it before applying a single square foot to a client's home. The house became a raw, visible blueprint of our exact capabilities. A freelance reporter from a regional housing publication noticed the unusual permit activity and drove down to the island. On a sweltering Sunday morning, they published a 4-page feature article. The bold headline highlighted a local woman transforming a severely blighted, foreclosed municipal nightmare into an affordable, working-class model for extreme weather resilience. The impact was instantaneous. The cheap plastic folding tables in my living room vibrated constantly. The dedicated company cell phone rang up to 30 times a single afternoon. Rosa filled 3 entire yellow legal pads with prospective client appointments in less than 48 hours. We were suddenly booked solid for the next 4 months. Just as the suffocating financial grip began to loosen, the Gulf of Mexico decided to remind us exactly who owned the coastline. It was not a named, categorized hurricane. It was a localized, vicious tropical depression that stalled directly over our specific county for 3 agonizing days. The sustained winds relentlessly hammered the island at 75 miles an hour. Rain fell in thick, blinding, sideways sheets that penetrated every tiny microscopic crack in the exterior siding. When the barometric pressure finally lifted on Thursday morning, I drove my rented truck out to assess the damage. My lungs felt like they had been completely filled with wet concrete. The storm had violently shredded the heavy protective tarps off 2 of our most critical active job sites. The custom milled, treated lumber I had purchased entirely on credit was heavily saturated and completely ruined. Several newly framed interior walls were severely warped from the pooling water. It was a catastrophic, devastating setback. The emergency cleanup crews and the immediate replacement materials completely vaporized Gulf Lantern's meager cash reserves in exactly 48 hours. I was suddenly backed into a brutal, unforgiving financial corner. I owed a mandatory payroll deposit to Elias, Tori, and Ben by Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock. I had a staggering invoice due at the commercial wholesale lumber yard. Rosa's specialized cardiac and blood pressure prescriptions required an immediate refill that cost $380 out of pocket. To make matters worse, the temporary roof patch on my own cottage had failed during the squall, leaving a steady, rhythmic drip pinging into a blue plastic bucket in the main hallway. I was standing in my cramped kitchen, staring blindly at the negative account balance on my phone screen, when a text message lit up the cracked glass. It was a Georgia area code, Celeste. She had obviously set up a digital keyword alert for my name and found the online version of the magazine article. Her message was venomous, precise, and incredibly short. Cute article. Playing house flip for long. She was actively watching me bleed from 1,000 miles away, eagerly waiting for me to finally drown in the debt she had saddled me with. I threw the phone violently onto the laminate counter and grabbed a heavy iron crowbar from my tool belt. I desperately needed to move. I needed to physically destroy something. The driving rain had pushed heavy water behind a section of the hallway paneling I had not yet replaced. I jammed the flat edge of the iron bar deep into the seam and ripped the swollen, rotting wood away from the wall studs with a loud, guttural yell. As the heavy panel crashed onto the buckled floorboards, a small, heavily sealed plastic pouch slipped out from a hollow cavity behind the diagonal cross bracing. It hit the floor with a soft thud. It was coated in at least 2 decades of thick gray dust. Inside was a folded piece of heavy yellow legal paper. I recognized my father's blocky, aggressive architectural handwriting immediately. It was a direct, written note addressed to my mother, a forgotten remnant of their original retrofit brainstorming sessions. I read the faded blue ink by the harsh, singular beam of my tactical flashlight. A good house is not a beautiful house first. It must be a safe house first. I stood entirely frozen in the damp hallway, reading those exact 2 sentences over and over until my accelerated heart rate began to slowly stabilize. In a sudden, violent flash of clarity, I realized my fatal strategic mistake. I was desperately trying to operate a highly traditional contracting business. I was floating massive amounts of expensive raw materials, carrying the severe physical risk of unpredictable weather delays, and stretching my credit to the absolute breaking point just to look like a successful, fully established construction firm. I was unconsciously playing the exact same fragile, debt-leveraged, ego-driven game my sister played in Atlanta. I had to fundamentally change the rules of engagement. I needed to immediately stop selling wood, nails, and labor hours. I needed to sell the one specific thing people living on this volatile island were absolutely terrified of losing. They were deathly afraid of unmitigated risk, of devastating financial loss, and of being brutally scammed by predatory contractors while they were emotionally vulnerable. I did not go out to the ruined job sites the next morning to cry over wet, warped wood. I put on my only clean black blazer, printed a comprehensive 50-page business prospectus, and drove straight across the causeway to a small, independent community bank on the mainland. I did not ask for a massive, unbacked emergency loan to buy more lumber. I sat directly across the heavy oak desk from the senior branch manager and laid out a completely restructured, highly insulated business model. I showed him the published magazine article, my pristine, state-certified claims adjusting record, and the exact, highly lucrative profit margins of a pure service-based pivot. I formally proposed transitioning Gulf Lantern away from holding any physical material inventory. Instead, I pitched a premium, specialized package, high-level structural design consulting, rigorous, forensic cost estimation, and strict, uncompromising contractor oversight. We would draft the bulletproof architectural plans, fiercely audit the complex insurance estimates, and rigorously manage the specialized installation crews. But the individual clients would purchase the raw materials directly from the suppliers. We would completely eliminate our own exposure to weather-related material losses. The branch manager scrutinized my mathematical projections in complete silence for a full hour. Then, he approved a highly targeted commercial line of credit for exactly $15,000. It was just enough capital to cover my team's payroll, strictly settle the outstanding lumberyard debt, and secure Rosa's vital medication. I walked out of the heavily air-conditioned bank lobby into the blinding Texas sunlight, breathing real, deep air for the first time in an entire week. The coastal storm had viciously tried to break my back, but it had only successfully taught me how to properly engineer an unbreakable financial foundation. The fundamental shift in our operational model changed everything. We were no longer chasing the weather. We were preempting it. Exactly 4 months after I restructured Gulf Lantern retrofit and design, a young, fiercely pragmatic commercial architect named Theo Bennett walked onto my newly reinforced front porch. Theo was managing a highly visible, ambitious project for a boutique hospitality group. They had recently purchased 7 historic 1920s-era wooden bungalows right on the seawall. The corporate investors desperately wanted a cheap, highly photogenic cosmetic flip. They wanted fresh pastel paint and imported decorative tile. Theo fundamentally refused. He wanted authentic, hardcore structural resilience, and he had read the local magazine feature detailing my exact methodology. Theo brought me into the corporate boardroom in downtown Galveston. I did not wear a suit. I wore my clean work boots and brought a thick binder of forensic structural data. I pitched a comprehensive, top-to-bottom fortification strategy. I detailed the exact installation of galvanized steel hurricane ties, high-impact resistant polycarbonate window glazing, and specialized moisture barriers that would drastically reduce their long-term commercial insurance premiums. I proved, using precise actuarial math, that spending an extra $150,000 on invisible structural integrity now would save them over $2 million in sheer replacement costs during the next major Category 4 event. We won the contract. It was a massive, multi-phase consulting and oversight project that instantly elevated Gulf Lantern from a scrappy local neighborhood service into a heavily respected, highly sought-after name across the entire Texas coastal development scene. But securing wealthy commercial clients was never my ultimate endgame. I wanted to protect the vulnerable, working-class neighborhoods that were constantly one bad storm away from total financial ruin. The biggest hurdle was always liquid capital. Genuine, weather-resistant home upgrades are incredibly expensive up front. To solve this, I returned to the exact same independent community bank that had issued my initial $15,000 lifeline. I sat down with their lending board and collaboratively designed a highly specialized, low-interest community credit initiative. If a local homeowner hired Gulf Lantern to verify and manage their storm resilience upgrades, the credit union would approve a specialized renovation loan with heavily subsidized interest rates. We transformed our firm into a place that did not just draft architectural blueprints. We systematically dismantled the terrifying financial barriers that kept regular families trapped in dangerous, failing houses. The energy inside the Galveston cottage shifted completely. The heavy, oppressive silence of grief and decay was entirely eradicated. Rosa experienced a miraculous, sweeping physical and psychological recovery. She abandoned the cumbersome aluminum walker, upgrading to a beautifully carved wooden cane. She no longer sat quietly in the corner watching me work. When traumatized, overwhelmed homeowners walked through our front door, clutching their denied insurance claims and fighting back tears of sheer frustration. I was not the first person they spoke to. Rosa greeted them. She sat them down at the kitchen table, poured them hot coffee, and told them the rich, enduring history of our cottage. She pointed to the exposed, reinforced framing and explained exactly how this very house had fiercely survived half a dozen devastating hurricanes while the massive, poorly built mansions down the street had washed completely away. I provided the cold, hard, analytical numbers, but Rosa provided the deep, unbreakable emotional trust. She became the beating heart of our entire operation. I wanted to share that exact same empowerment. On the first Saturday morning of every month, I cleared out the massive supply of reclaimed lumber in the backyard and opened the heavy garage doors. I hosted free intensive weekend workshops specifically designed for local women. I taught them the fundamental, raw mechanics of household survival. I showed them how to properly operate a heavy circular saw without fear. I taught them how to install mold-resistant drywall, how to aggressively apply exterior waterproofing sealants, and most importantly, how to meticulously read and translate a densely coded 30-page construction estimate. I wanted to ensure that no predatory contractor could ever walk into their living rooms and intimidate them with bloated, fraudulent numbers again. Gulf Lantern began to grow deep, unbreakable roots straight into the community soil. As our fierce reputation actively spread into the neighboring coastal districts, the volume of high-level contracts forced me to scale the company. I aggressively hired brilliant, hungry young estimators and seasoned project managers. I spent late nights drafting strict standard operating procedures. I had to learn how to be a highly effective corporate boss without ever devolving into the ruthless, detached, spreadsheet-obsessed executives I had utterly despised during my time at the corporate insurance firm. I paid my crew significantly above the standard market rate, provided comprehensive health insurance, and demanded absolute perfection on every single job site. Meanwhile, on the completely opposite side of the spectrum, the ghost of my past was aggressively trying to project a wildly different version of success. Through the tight-knit, highly gossipy network of old Houston family acquaintances, news about my sister inevitably trickled down to the coast. Celeste had formally relocated to the affluent suburbs of Atlanta. She had recently gotten engaged to a man named Grant Holloway, a slick, fast-talking commercial real estate developer. Together, they had violently thrown themselves into the high-end, luxury house flipping market. From the outside, their life looked like a flawless, glittering magazine spread. They constantly posted perfectly curated photos of sprawling marble kitchens, imported Italian lighting fixtures, and massive, artificially landscaped estates. But I understood the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of luxury real estate development. I knew exactly what happened when you violently prioritized the expensive veneer over the solid foundation. They were actively living on massive, highly dangerous leverage. They were floating multiple, high-interest, short-term bridge loans to finance their glamorous lifestyle, desperately relying on a perpetually booming housing market to outrun their staggering, compounding debt. I did not waste a single second actively tracking my sister's social media. I did not care about her marble countertops. But the scattered updates felt like a persistent, deeply annoying echo of a past life that simply refused to die. Her aggressive posturing served as a constant, glaring reminder of exactly why I needed to secure my own perimeter. I realized that building a successful company was only half the battle. Vigorously defending it from outside predators was the other. I aggressively sought out the most ruthless, brilliant corporate attorney on the Gulf Coast, a woman named Maris Velez. Maris did not smile often, but she knew the Texas corporate legal code like a weapon. I sat in her heavily air-conditioned office for 3 solid hours and laid out my entire family history, the bitter estate settlement, and the rapid, explosive growth of Gulf Lantern. Maris immediately recognized the severe vulnerabilities. We spent the next 2 months systematically erecting a massive, impenetrable legal fortress around everything I had built. We formally separated the assets into multiple, highly insulated layers. We established a primary operating company for the day-to-day contracting business. We aggressively copyrighted the Gulf Lantern trademark and proprietary architectural designs. Most importantly, we moved the physical deed of the Galveston cottage and the surrounding land into a highly restricted, irrevocable real estate trust. We actively built a corporate structure so complex and legally aggressive that absolutely no one, especially not a desperate, heavily leveraged sister armed with fake sentimentality and a sudden change of heart, could ever pierce the corporate veil. I ensured that the empire I had violently pulled from the rotting, salt-eaten wood could never be stolen away by a few cheap legal tricks or manipulative, emotional games. I was no longer just surviving the storms. I was actively engineering a reality where absolutely nothing could tear my foundation apart. Exactly 5 years after that suffocating afternoon in the Houston living room, the Galveston property bore absolutely no resemblance to the flayed, dying creature I had initially inherited. We had not just repaired it, we had meticulously resurrected it with uncompromising purpose and heavy-duty engineering. The entire core structure now sat securely elevated on deep-driven concrete pilings, keeping the vulnerable floor joists high above any projected storm surge. We wrapped the exterior walls in premium, marine-grade fiber cement siding, completely impervious to the biting salt wind that used to eat the old wood alive. The collapsed front porch had been flawlessly recreated using dense, reclaimed cypress wood, polished to a warm, honeyed glow that invited you to sit and stay. It did not look like one of those garish, sterile vacation rentals slapped together with cheap vinyl and hollow fiberglass for a quick summer profit. It possessed a deep, enduring gravity. It was a home that looked perfectly capable of taking a direct hit from a Category 5 wall of water and standing utterly unmoved. It radiated a quiet, deeply earned wealth. The sagging, forgotten backyard garage had undergone an equally radical evolution. It was now the beating creative heart of Gulf Lantern retrofit and design. We reinforced the original heavy timber trusses with thick steel plates, installed massive impact-resistant skylights to flood the space with natural sun, and transformed the cavernous interior into our official material studio and drafting headquarters. When prospective clients walked through the heavy custom iron doors Tori had welded by hand, they did not see a standard, boring corporate lobby. They saw a living, breathing testament to our entire building philosophy. Thick slabs of architectural concrete, categorized cross-sections of waterproof foundation membranes, and detailed physical models of wind-resistant roofing systems lined the exposed brick walls. My firm had quietly grown from a desperate, one-woman operation fighting black mold into a fiercely respected regional powerhouse. I now carried a full-time payroll of exactly 24 dedicated employees, ranging from structural engineers to specialized finish carpenters. Our primary project calendar was completely locked down for the next 9 months, and the meticulous, unyielding quality of our resilience work had recently earned us a massive 6-page spread in the premier Texas Architectural Quarterly. Rosa navigated this bustling, high-energy environment with the slow, deliberate grace of a seasoned matriarch. She relied entirely on a beautifully carved cherry wood cane now, her physical pace much slower, but her mind remained as sharp and unforgiving as a steel trap. She had officially taken charge of a specialized community initiative we launched last year. We named it the Flores Memorial Trust. directly honoring the original vision my parents had for this very neighborhood. It was a dedicated, fully funded apprenticeship fund exclusively designed to provide heavy equipment training, expensive certification fees, and premium safety gear for local women fiercely determined to break into the commercial construction trades. To facilitate this exact program, I had aggressively purchased the abandoned, weed-choked lot directly adjacent to our property. The city had previously valued it at next to nothing, treating it as a blighted eyesore dragging down the street. I leveled the dirt, secured it with heavy industrial fencing, and transformed it into Gulf Lantern's primary material staging yard and hands-on training campus. The land my sister had sneeringly dismissed as a toxic waste dump was now a heavily fortified, highly functional, and aggressively appreciating asset block. The undeniable physical transformation of our immediate corner began to actively shift the entire neighborhood's trajectory. Recognizing the localized success of our resilient building models, the Municipal Planning Board formally announced a massive, multi-million-dollar infrastructure initiative to upgrade the seawall and deep-water drainage systems along our specific coastal corridor. The moment that public announcement hit the local press, the quiet, ignored streets suddenly smelled heavily of speculative capital. Aggressive real estate developers, the exact type of people who would never have stepped foot on this island 5 years ago, began circling the blocks in expensive luxury vehicles. They flooded my mailbox with glossy, uninvited cash offers, blindly hoping to acquire my deeply fortified double lot before the rising property values completely locked them out forever. They saw raw profit. I saw the fortress I had bled for. I threw every single one of those heavy linen envelopes directly into the heavy-duty office paper shredder without a second thought. I did not know it at the time, but the very same economic forces that were aggressively multiplying the value of my deeply rooted foundation were actively and violently dismantling the hollow, leveraged empire my sister had built in Georgia. The national financial climate had shifted brutally. Commercial interest rates had spiked dramatically over the past 12 months. The hyperinflated, luxury house flipping market, Celeste and Grant, had bet their entire identities on suddenly crashed into a solid brick wall. Their astronomical variable rate bridge loans were rapidly maturing. The absurdly wealthy buyers they desperately relied upon to purchase their cosmetic, overpriced mansions had completely vanished into thin air. Their massive, sprawling development sites were sitting entirely empty, burning through tens of thousands of dollars in carrying costs every single month. The glamorous, perfectly curated digital facade they relentlessly maintained online was actively bleeding out behind the screen. Grant was reportedly facing immediate, catastrophic defaults on 3 separate high-end commercial properties. The ruthless private equity lenders were aggressively preparing to seize their assets and freeze their remaining bank accounts. In the middle of that suffocating, inescapable financial panic, Celeste was desperately scrambling to locate any unencumbered, liquid capital to temporarily stop the bleeding. And for the very first time in half a decade, she did not think of the Galveston cottage as a piece of rotting, disposable garbage. Driven by sheer, unadulterated desperation, she actively looked up the current municipal tax assessments for the Texas coastal properties. She saw the newly evaluated, heavily appreciated numbers attached to my name and the adjacent double lot. The shabby house she had gleefully used to banish me from the family fortune was no longer a cruel joke. To a woman actively drowning in a sea of toxic debt, my fortified, highly profitable compound suddenly looked exactly like a life raft. I spent that Tuesday evening sitting quietly on the reclaimed cypress porch with Rosa, drinking iced tea and watching the dark, heavy clouds gathering far out over the choppy Gulf waters. The coastal barometer was dropping steadily, signaling a sudden, unpredictable shift in the atmospheric pressure. I had spent the last 5 years meticulously engineering this entire property to withstand the absolute worst physical violence nature could throw at it. I felt entirely secure. I had absolutely no idea that a completely different kind of storm, driven entirely by greed, entitlement, and absolute financial terror, was already packing its designer luggage and driving straight toward my heavily reinforced front gate. exactly on the 5-year anniversary of the day I first stepped foot onto the island. The heavy, oppressive humidity broke, leaving the coastal air sharp and clear. I was standing near the reinforced steel gates of the material yard when a massive, black luxury sport utility vehicle pulled off the main road and crunched loudly onto my crushed gravel driveway. The dark-tinted windows rolled down, and the engine idled with a low, expensive purr. The passenger door opened, and Celeste stepped out into the bright Texas sunlight. She was dressed perfectly for a high-level corporate luncheon, wearing a tailored cream silk blouse and sharply creased designer trousers that looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of an active construction campus. A second later, the driver door opened, and Grant Holloway emerged. He wore a sharply cut navy blazer over a crisp white shirt, but the forced, confident smile on his face did not quite reach his eyes. Celeste moved toward me with her arms wide open, her face twisted into an expression of profound, manufactured sorrow. She let out a choked, dramatic gasp as she wrapped her arms around my shoulders. She smelled of expensive, heavy floral perfume and sheer desperation. "Morgan, my God, it has been far too long," she whispered loudly, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated theatrical emotion. "I have missed you so much. We are still family, no matter what happens." I did not raise my arms to return the embrace. I stood completely still, my hands resting calmly at my sides, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical wave of revulsion. Her words were dripping with artificial sweetness, but I could feel the rigid, anxious tension vibrating through her entire body. When she finally pulled back, pretending to wipe a non-existent tear from her eye, Grant stepped forward and offered a firm, aggressively practiced handshake. However, he did not look at my face. His sharp, calculating eyes were completely detached from the emotional reunion his fiancée was staging. He was staring past my shoulder, rapidly scanning the heavy timber trusses of the drafting studio, measuring the wide frontage of the double lot, and calculating the exact square footage of the commercial staging yard. He looked exactly like a starving man staring at a 5-course meal. He was a deeply leveraged real estate developer, aggressively hunting for unencumbered equity to save his own sinking ship, and my fortified, debt-free compound was the biggest life raft he had ever seen. I did not invite them into the private residential spaces of the cottage. I led them straight into the cavernous, air-conditioned main office of the garage studio. The space was intimidating by design, dominated by a massive, custom-built oak conference table covered in thick architectural blueprints and heavy material samples. They took a seat on the opposite side of the table. The silence stretched out, heavy and thick. Celeste folded her manicured hands tightly together, her knuckles turning slightly white. The flawless, confident veneer she projected on her social media accounts was heavily fractured in person. There were dark, heavy circles meticulously concealed under her expensive foundation, and a sharp, frantic energy behind her eyes that completely betrayed her calm posture. After 10 minutes of agonizing, hollow small talk about the local weather and the island traffic, Grant finally leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the oak wood. He dropped the polite facade and shifted directly into the aggressive, fast-talking pitch of a corporate raider. "You have built a very cute little operation here. Morgan," Grant began, his tone dripping with thick, condescending authority. "But let us be realistic about the future. The municipal infrastructure is upgrading, and this specific coastal corridor is about to explode. You are sitting on prime, high-density commercial dirt, and running a modest neighborhood repair service is a massive underutilization of the asset. Celeste and I have a vision for a premium, high-yield redevelopment." Celeste nodded eagerly, leaning in to layer the toxic emotional manipulation over his cold financial pitch. "Morgan, we want to build an exclusive, luxury waterfront enclave, a highly curated, high-end residential community, and we want you to be a part of it. Mom and Dad would absolutely hate that we have been separated for so long. They would want us to pool our resources. They would want us to win together, as a united family." The The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her statement hung in the cold air of the room. She spoke with absolute, terrifying conviction, acting exactly as if she had not ruthlessly severed my financial lifeline, dumped a dying relative on my shoulders, and abandoned me to drown in municipal debt exactly 5 years ago. She was effortlessly trying to weaponize the memory of the very parents she had exploited to steal my original inheritance. Grant reached into his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, professionally bound legal document. He slid the heavy folder across the smooth oak table until it stopped precisely in front of my hands. "This is a finalized joint venture agreement," Grant stated, tapping the cover with his index finger. "We are offering to officially fold this entire property into our primary Georgia-based development portfolio. We will issue you a cash buyout of $400,000 for the dirt, plus a 10% non-voting equity share in the new luxury project. In exchange, you simply sign over the primary deed and grant my firm absolute operational control of the site development." I did not need to open the thick binder to understand the brutal predatory mathematics of their offer. As a professional estimator who spent every single day dismantling fraudulent construction bids, their desperation was glaringly obvious. The newly upgraded city zoning and the heavy structural fortifications I had built made this compound worth at least $2 million on the open commercial market today. Grant was offering me a fraction of its actual value, wrapped in completely useless, non-voting paper shares of a phantom project that would likely never break ground. I looked directly into Grant's eyes, reading the sheer panic hiding just beneath his aggressive posture. This was not a lucrative business expansion for them. This was a frantic, last-ditch emergency maneuver. The high-interest commercial bridge loans on their massive, unsold luxury flips in Atlanta were undoubtedly maturing right now. The private equity lenders were actively closing in, threatening total foreclosure. Grant and Celeste desperately needed to secure my highly valuable, completely debt-free real estate to forcefully collateralize a new line of credit and stop their own financial bleeding. They had driven 1,000 miles because I was the very last piece of unencumbered equity they could attempt to steal. A younger, far more emotional version of myself would have stood up, screamed until my throat was raw, and violently thrown them both off the property. I would have shoved that insulting, predatory contract right back into Grant's chest and listed every single agonizing hardship Celeste had intentionally forced me to endure. But I did not feel a single drop of anger. Anger requires a personal connection, and the woman sitting across from me was nothing more than a highly predictable, incredibly desperate liability. I felt a cold, deep, and absolute sense of power. I was holding every single card in the deck, and they were completely blind to it. I let my hands rest lightly on top of the bound contract. I did not open it. I offered them a polite, utterly unreadable corporate smile. "This is an incredibly detailed and aggressive proposal," I said, my voice smooth, calm, and perfectly measured. "I appreciate the time you took to draft it. However, I never make major structural decisions regarding the firm's assets on the spot. As it happens, I have a major public announcement regarding the permanent, long-term future of this entire commercial footprint scheduled for tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. There will be local press, community leaders, and my entire staff present. It would be highly beneficial for both of you to be here to witness it before we discuss any transfer of equity." Celeste's posture instantly relaxed. A huge, genuine wave of relief washed over her strained face, completely softening the tight lines around her mouth. She looked at Grant, exchanging a rapid, victorious glance. In her incredibly arrogant, self-absorbed mind, my calm demeanor and refusal to fight back meant only one thing. She genuinely believed I was yielding. She thought I was still the traumatized, overwhelmed little sister who was deeply desperate for familial approval and completely terrified of handling real corporate wealth. She assumed my scheduled announcement was going to be a public surrender, a tearful reunion where I gladly handed the heavy burden of the property over to her experienced, successful fiancé. "Of course, Morgan," Celeste practically cooed, standing up and smoothing her silk blouse with triumphant energy. "We would be absolutely honored to be there. I knew you would see reason. We are going to build a massive empire together." They walked out of the studio with the confident, arrogant swagger of conquerors who had just successfully secured a hostile takeover without firing a single shot. I stood by the heavy iron doors and watched their black vehicle pull out of the driveway and disappear down the sunlit coastal road. I turned back to the massive oak conference table, picked up their thick, insulting joint venture contract, and casually tossed it directly into the heavy metal trash can. Celeste believed she had just expertly manipulated me into saving her life. I let her believe it, and that false sense of absolute victory was going to be the single most expensive, devastating mistake my sister would ever make. By 10 o'clock that evening, the heavy coastal darkness had fully settled over the island. I was sitting at the massive oak conference table in the garage studio, nursing a mug of black coffee, when my cell phone vibrated. It was a text message from a distant cousin I had not spoken to in over 4 years. Attached was a screenshot of a lengthy, highly dramatized social media post Celeste had just published to her thousands of followers. My sister was not wasting a single minute. She was already launching a preemptive, highly coordinated smear campaign. The post featured a carefully filtered, tragic-looking photograph of the two of us standing near our parents' graves exactly 5 years ago. Below the image was a masterclass in toxic, manipulative storytelling. Celeste spun a devastating, entirely fabricated narrative claiming I had coldly cut her out of my life out of pure jealousy. Much worse, she explicitly accused me of legally exploiting our elderly, vulnerable aunt, manipulating Rosa into signing away her residential rights so I could hoard the family real estate for my own corporate profit. The cousin's text warned me that Celeste had already spent the last 3 hours calling every extended family member in Texas and Georgia, loudly hinting that she was preparing to file a massive, multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit to formally contest the original estate settlement and demand a forced division of my Galveston compound. It was a classic, desperate corporate intimidation tactic. She was actively trying to destroy my professional reputation and isolate me from the family before she formally demanded the property the next morning. I did not panic. I simply forwarded the screenshot directly to my corporate attorney, Maris Velez. Maris arrived at the garage studio less than 45 minutes later. She did not wear a suit at this hour, dressed simply in dark jeans and a heavy sweater, but her sharp, predatory legal mind was fully engaged. She dropped a thick, heavily tabbed leather binder directly onto the oak table. She is actively laying the groundwork for a hostile equity grab by claiming elder abuse and fiduciary fraud, Maris stated, her voice devoid of any surprise. It is a desperate, incredibly sloppy move. I have already compiled the absolute counter-evidence. Maris opened the binder to reveal meticulously highlighted bank records and sworn, notarized affidavits. There was absolutely no legal or financial ambiguity. Maris had the exact wire transfer logs, proving Celeste had intentionally, maliciously severed Rosa's living stipend exactly 8 months before our parents even passed away. We had a massive, irrefutable paper trail documenting every single dollar I had personally invested into Rosa's medical care and the structural preservation of the cottage. A soft knock on the heavy iron doors interrupted our review. Elias Boone stepped into the studio, holding his battered smartphone in his calloused hand. He had heard the expensive luxury vehicle arrive earlier that afternoon and intuitively understood that trouble had followed it. "I was digging through some old digital backups from the neighborhood association," Elias said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I thought you might need to hear this. It is a voicemail your sister left for a local commercial real estate broker exactly 4.5 years ago, right after you started tearing out the rotten drywall." He placed the phone on the table and pressed play. The audio quality was slightly degraded, but Celeste's sharp, deeply condescending voice echoed crystal clear through the quiet studio. "Do not bother listing it." Celeste's recorded voice sneered through the speaker. "The property is a complete toxic liability. Just let the wood rot, and let the city bulldoze it for all I care. My sister can drown in the municipal fines." It was the absolute smoking gun. It completely vaporized her new, manufactured narrative of deep familial concern and proved undeniable: malicious abandonment. But the final, earth-shattering piece of the puzzle did not come from a lawyer or a retired electrician. It came from the residential side of the property. The heavy side door of the studio clicked open, and Rosa walked slowly into the room. She was leaning heavily on her carved cherry wood cane, carrying a small, incredibly dense, fireproof metal lockbox in her free hand. She walked directly up to the conference table and placed the heavy box down with a solid thud. "Your mother gave me this the month before she went into the hospital for the final time," Rosa said, her voice carrying a heavy, solemn gravity. "She gave me strict, explicit instructions. I was absolutely forbidden to open it or give it to you unless this exact house was facing a genuine, hostile threat from family greed. I believe your sister arriving today in that black car qualifies." Rosa handed me a small brass key. My hands, which had been perfectly steady all evening, trembled slightly as I unlocked the heavy metal latch. Inside the box lay a single, standard digital storage drive. I plugged the drive into my laptop. A single video file populated on the screen. I clicked play. The image flickered to life, showing my mother and father sitting side by side in the sunroom of their Houston house. They both looked incredibly frail, deeply ravaged by the aggressive illnesses that would soon take them, but their eyes were bright, lucid, and fiercely determined. "Morgan," my father's recorded voice began, heavy with exhaustion, but incredibly clear. "If you are watching this, it means the legal protections we tried to set up have failed, and your sister is trying to take the Galveston property from you." My mother reached out and took my father's hand on the screen. "We need you to understand the absolute truth," she said, looking directly into the camera lens. "The coastal cottage was never a leftover scrap. It was never a punishment. It was the only tangible, meaningful asset we specifically, intentionally carved out and locked away exclusively for you." I sat completely frozen in the heavy leather desk chair, all the ambient noise in the studio fading into absolute silence. "We made a terrible, devastating mistake," my father confessed, his face tight with deep regret. "When the medical bills started piling up, we gave Celeste too much financial control too quickly. By the time we realized she was aggressively draining the liquid accounts and hiding the stock portfolios, we were simply too weak to fight her in court. But we managed to isolate the coastal deed. We knew Celeste only valued things that were already polished and expensive," my mother continued, a small, sad smile crossing her face. "She would look at that rotting wood and see absolutely nothing but garbage. But we knew you, Morgan. We knew you had the grit, the brilliant technical mind, and the sheer, unbreakable willpower to look past the decay and rebuild the foundation. We left it to you because we knew, with absolute certainty, that you were the only person capable of turning it into a fortress." The video ended, the screen fading to stark black. I sat in the profound silence of the garage studio, surrounded by the three people who had actively helped me survive the last 5 years. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried since the day of the funeral, the deep, toxic belief that my parents had completely abandoned me to the wolves, evaporated entirely. They had not thrown me away. They had actively trusted me with their most resilient legacy. They knew exactly who I was, and they knew exactly who my sister was. Maris Velez broke the silence, tapping her pen sharply against the legal binder. "I can file an emergency injunction with the county judge the second the courthouse opens at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. We can serve her with a preemptive restraining order before she even finishes her morning coffee." I looked at the black screen of the laptop, then down at the audio file on Elias's phone, and finally at the thick stack of undeniable financial evidence Maris had compiled. I had a loaded arsenal. I could legally crush my sister right now, in the dark, behind closed doors. But crushing her quietly would not change the narrative she was aggressively spinning to the world. A quiet legal settlement would allow her to forever play the victim, claiming I had used expensive lawyers to bully her out of her rightful inheritance. "No," I said, my voice completely calm, devoid of all anger. replaced by a chilling, absolute strategic clarity. We are not filing anything in the dark. We are going to let her walk right through the front gates tomorrow morning. We are going to let her stand perfectly confident in front of the cameras, the local community, and my entire staff. We are going to let her believe she has absolutely won. I stood up from the heavy oak table and looked out the reinforced window toward the dark, rolling waves of the Gulf. I was no longer just preparing to protect a piece of high-value commercial real estate. When the sun came up, I was going to systematically, publicly, and permanently dismantle the entire psychological empire my sister had built on top of my supposed weakness. I was going to let her pull the trigger on her own absolute destruction. By 8:30 the next morning, the crushed gravel staging yard adjacent to the cottage had been completely transformed. A raised wooden platform stood directly in front of the polished cypress porch. My entire crew, all 24 dedicated employees wearing their navy blue company shirts, flanked the sides of the stage. The front rows of folding chairs were occupied by our most loyal clients, the women from the weekend repair workshops, local municipal representatives, and several journalists from the regional housing publications. The morning air was crisp and heavily scented with salt, carrying an electric, undeniable current of anticipation. Exactly at 9 o'clock, the familiar black luxury vehicle pulled up to the reinforced gates. Celeste and Grant stepped out into the bright morning sun. They had clearly dressed for a massive corporate victory. Celeste wore a stunning, sharply tailored crimson dress, her hair blown out into perfect, expensive waves. Grant sported a custom gray suit, his posture radiating the smug, predatory confidence of a man who firmly believed he was about to swallow my entire operation whole and save his own sinking empire in the process. They walked directly to the front row, whispering to each other with victorious smiles, completely blind to the reality of the stage they had just stepped in front of. Celeste offered a small, patronizing wave to the local reporters, clearly assuming this entire crowd had been assembled to witness her grand return to the family throne and the lucrative buyout of my firm. I walked up the short wooden steps to the podium. I did not wear a corporate blazer today. I wore my heavy canvas work jacket and my steel-toed boots. I looked out over the faces of the people who had actively helped me survive. Then I looked directly down at my sister. "Good morning," I said, my voice projecting loud and clear through the sound system, cutting over the ambient noise of the coastal wind. 5 years ago, I stood on a ruined, collapsed porch right behind where you are sitting now. This property was drowning in municipal debt, eaten alive by black mold, and fundamentally abandoned. Today, we are not gathering to announce a commercial sale. We are not yielding a single inch of this ground to luxury developers or private equity firms. I saw Grant's smug smile instantly freeze. His posture stiffened, his eyes narrowing sharply as his predatory brain desperately tried to process the sudden deviation from his script. Celeste just looked confused, her perfectly painted lips parting slightly. "Instead," I continued, my tone dropping into a cold, unbreakable register, "I am incredibly proud to formally announce the permanent establishment of the Flores Resilience House. As of 8 o'clock this morning, the deed to this entire double lot, the original cottage, and the commercial drafting studios have been irrevocably transferred into a heavily protected municipal nonprofit trust. This property is now legally locked into a perpetual charter as a community training center, an extreme weather construction simulator, and a dedicated resource hub for working-class families facing coastal disasters." A loud, genuine wave of applause erupted from the crowd. Sarah, Elias, and Tori were cheering from the sidelines, but I kept my eyes entirely fixed on the front row. The reality of my words slammed into Grant and Celeste like a physical shockwave. The commercial zoning they lusted after was completely neutralized. The $400,000 buyout offer and the useless 10% equity shares they tried to leverage were dead on arrival. The land was now completely untouchable. It could never be bought, sold, or aggressively collateralized to pay off their massive, defaulting loans in Atlanta. The life raft they had desperately driven 1,000 miles to steal had just been permanently anchored to the ocean floor. Celeste's flawless composure violently shattered. The profound, suffocating terror of her impending bankruptcy ripped right through her elegant mask. She leaped out of her folding chair. Her face flushed dark red with pure, unadulterated rage. "You absolute thief!" Celeste screamed, her voice shrill and echoing harshly against the heavy wooden siding of the house. She completely ignored the flashing cameras of the local press, pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "You cannot do this. This is family property. You legally manipulated a sick, elderly woman to steal my inheritance. You are standing up there playing the generous community saint, but you are a fraud. I am taking you to federal court. I will tear this entire ridiculous charity down to the dirt." The crowd fell into a stunned, highly uncomfortable silence. Celeste stood breathing heavily, looking around wildly, expecting the audience to turn on me, expecting her loud, aggressive narrative of victimhood to immediately take root. I did not raise my voice. I did not even lean into the microphone. I simply stepped back and nodded to Maris Velez, who was standing quietly near the edge of the platform. Maris walked briskly to the podium, connecting her tablet to the large digital presentation monitor positioned behind us. She did not bother with a polite introduction. "For the benefit of the press and the municipal representatives present," Maris stated, her voice sharp, clinical, and completely devoid of emotion. "My firm handles the legal structuring for Gulf Lantern and the newly established trust. In light of the severe public accusations of elder abuse and financial fraud, just leveled by Celeste Flores, we are legally obligated to present the immediate counter-evidence." Maris tapped the screen. A massive, highly magnified image of a bank wire log appeared. The dates and routing numbers were highlighted in bright yellow. "These are the certified financial records from exactly 8 months prior to the passing of the Flores parents," Maris explained calmly. "They legally document the exact moment Celeste Flores unilaterally severed the survival stipend for Rosa Delgado, completely abandoning a disabled family member without heat, medication, or basic groceries, long before any property dispute existed." Celeste's face drained of all color. She took a step back, her mouth opening and closing silently. Maris tapped the screen a second time. An audio file graphic appeared. "This is a recorded message left by Celeste Flores for a commercial broker, completely abandoning the asset she now claims to cherish." Elias's recovered audio file blared through the heavy speakers. Celeste's own sneering, condescending voice filled the yard. "Do not bother listing it. The property is a complete toxic liability. Just let the wood rot and let the city bulldoze it for all I care. My sister can drown in the municipal fines." The collective gasp from the crowd was audible. The local journalists were furiously typing on their phones. The narrative of the betrayed, loving sister had just been violently publicly executed by her own recorded words. But the final, devastating blow was yet to come. Rosa Delgado, sitting proudly in the front row with her carved cherry wood cane resting across her lap, gave Maris a firm, singular nod. "Finally," Maris said, the absolute authority of a judge handing down a terminal sentence ringing in her voice. "To permanently settle the matter of the parents' true intent." The screen faded to black, and then the video file began to play. The massive, high-definition monitor displayed my mother and father sitting in their sunroom. The entire yard fell completely silent. The only sound was the harsh coastal wind and the clear, echoing voices of the dead speaking directly to the living. The crowd watched my father admit to the catastrophic mistake of trusting Celeste with the liquid assets. They watched my mother look directly into the camera lens and explicitly state that the rotting cottage was specifically carved out for me. They heard her say, with absolute conviction, that Celeste only valued superficial, expensive things and would see the property as garbage. They heard my parents declare that I was the only person with the grit and the brilliant technical mind to rebuild the foundation and turn the ruin into a fortress. When the video ended, the silence in the staging yard was heavy, crushing, and absolute. Every single pair of eyes in the crowd turned directly toward Celeste. There was no sympathy. There was no confusion. They looked at her with pure, unfiltered disgust, She was completely exposed, stripped of her designer armor and her false emotional leverage. She was standing in the bright sunlight as exactly what she was, a parasite who had abandoned her family for shiny things and only returned when she was starving. Grant Holloway did not say a single word to his fiancée. He was a ruthless corporate developer, and his brain calculated risk with cold precision. He looked at the ironclad legal trust on the screen. He looked at the press documenting every second, and he looked at the utterly destroyed public image of the woman standing next to him. He realized he had just walked into an active minefield of toxic public relations and insurmountable legal barriers. He physically took 3 large steps away from Celeste, severing his association instantly. Without looking back, he turned on his heel, walked briskly to the black sport utility vehicle, got inside, and slammed the heavy door shut. The engine roared, and he drove away, abandoning her in the exact same cold, calculated manner she had once abandoned me. Celeste stood completely alone in the center of the crowd, trembling violently. The crushing reality of her massive debts, the loss of her wealthy fiancé, and the absolute public destruction of her reputation all crashed down on her at once. I walked slowly down the wooden steps of the stage. The crowd parted silently, allowing me to walk right up to where my sister stood. I looked at her perfectly manicured hands, her expensive silk dress, and the sheer, empty terror shining in her eyes. I felt no urge to scream. The war was already over, and the earth had been salted. I held her gaze, my voice completely steady, delivering the final verdict. "You told me to take this shabby house," I said, the words ringing with absolute, terrifying finality. "I took it. I just built something out of it that you will never comprehend." Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please drop a comment below and let me know exactly where in the world you are listening from, so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to Violet Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit the notification bell so this story can be heard by even more people.